Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Powell, for appearing here today. It's good to see you, sir. We were talking a little bit earlier about fiscal policy, and one of the good things about going near the end is I get to hear a lot of good things. Talking about fiscal policy and trying to prevent a downturn, had a couple questions to talk about incentivizing investment, sort of for the average American. And looking at policy, just some thoughts about, looking at, is it higher taxes, lower taxes? Is it the USMCA or something like CECL, that we've discussed before? What are some of the quick take on some of the policies that would help as far as economic growth for the average American? And I just wanted to get, some of your thoughts on that.
I think, generally, I think we need policies that will, policies that will support labor force participation, policies that will qualify people to hold jobs and progress through their careers. That's a big thing. That's a place where the United States lags other comparable economies. And it's really something we need a national strategy to work on, is how can we raise labor force participation? It won't be any one thing, it'll be a range of things. The other piece of it is productivity. And productivity is really a combination of a couple things. One is incentives for investment in technology, which drives productivity. I think basic research by the government has actually been an underlying driver over long periods of time. In addition, it's skills and aptitudes of the workforce, which we've been talking about. It's, more productive workers have more skills and more training and that kind of thing. So, you can break it down into labor force participation and productivity. Those are the two things that really determine the country's longer run growth, as of course population growth as well. But assuming a level of population growth, it's labor force participation and productivity.
Thank you. I think we talked, you said 62.8% of the service, but I do have some concerns, Mr. Chairman, regarding the other part of your proposal that envisions the Fed itself entering the market for faster payments as a direct competitor to the private sector. And my understanding is that the Fed seeks to justify this potential action in part on perceived need for resiliency, which I believe raises several important questions. And I would say first, it's the notion that having two systems would provide resiliency necessarily assumes that every bank in the country, or at least an overwhelming majority of them, would have to connect to two systems, the private sector system and the yet-to-be-built government-run system. And this is just based on my experience in big data when you're talking about what I've had to do in the military with electronic warfare. And looking at this and actually trying to interoperate systems. And I think this would create enormous inefficiencies and impose needless costs on the American taxpayer and the private sector, unless, of course, the Fed-run system would be fully interoperable with all the private sector alternatives. So my question is, if I'm a community banker in Virginia, where I'm from, and I participate on the Fed system, what guarantees can you give that community bank today and the two systems will be fully interoperable? And if there are none, then what is the purpose of having a second government-run system?
So as I think you know, this was based on a proposal from the Faster Payments Task Force, which had very broad representation, including the smaller banks, who were quite supportive of this idea. We asked for public comment on this. We're reviewing that comment. We got, 400 comment letters or 900 or something, a lot of comment letters, and so we're in the middle of that decision-making process. In terms of interoperability, and again, it was the community banks who strongly pushed the Fed to move forward with this. In terms of interoperability, it's a good issue, a good question, and we'll need to work to make that happen, at least to the level that it's functional. It may not be perfect, but we'll certainly be, if we move forward with this, we'd be certainly looking at that as a characteristic to achieve.
Thank you, and I think it goes back to resiliency for me, and I know, and I think it's the concern about resiliency that I had, and when we had our discussion here in committee, is that if there are concerns about resiliency, and it's just based on my experience in the private sector when it comes to big data, couldn't you probably address those concerns through the regulatory and supervisor authority that already exists in your space? And that's what I was getting to here. If we're talking about resiliency with the multiple data centers and redundant systems that actually could be a problem with interoperability, do you think resiliency could be something that's a function of what you're doing right now and keeping with one sort of faster time payment system? I think I'm done.